Ardale smelled the bodies long before she saw them. The night sky made seeing any rising smoke difficult, but there was no obstacle to her sharp nose. It stank of burning meat. It wasn't game meat either, neither venison nor fowl. This was a scent she'd only scented in war, when she personally witnessed entire cities being put to the torch. It was the scent of burning human flesh. Intrigued, Ardale began to run. She was a live, beautiful girl who kept her dark hair tied back in a practical ponytail, dressed in protective black travelling leathers, and a short cloak that kept her comfortable and warm when she had to spend long hours in the wilderness. She had spent the day carefully traversing the monster-filled Dusken Woods, also known as the Darkened Forest, and now night had fallen over it, saturating her surroundings in eerie darkness. Nothing she couldn't handle, of course. She was the best. Ardale was what was commonly known as a reclaimer. For the right amount of money, she risked her life seeking lost knowledge of the world and selling it to the highest bidder. Her profession was often derided as mere treasure hunting or scavenging, but she could care less about the heated words of jealous losers who couldn't match her skills. Let their envious tongues waggle while she happily counted her gold. Her mission this night was an interesting one. She had been contracted by the famous Orium Order on a mission to locate two missing reclaimers who had originally been hired to investigate the Dusken Woods in search of a suspected dungeon. Ardale normally eschewed search and rescue quests. Rescuing hostages always involved dealing with loaded criminals or getting immersed in politics, and really, who had time for that nonsense? Also, reclaiming foolish reclaimers who had gotten in over their heads was simply beneath her. Reclamation was a dangerous business that quickly sorted the wheat from the chaff. The attrition rate for beginners was staggering, as it should be. That was what allowed a proven veteran like Ardale to name her price. Still, adding a possible dungeon to the mix was enough to make this worth her time. Dungeons were areas of the world that had somehow become infested with reality-warping void magic that terraformed them into gateways to other realities. Each one was unique and filled with dangerous etheric beings and monsters. But there were also troves of extremely rare knowledge and artifacts. Conquering dungeons was a surefire path to fortune and fame. The profits that could be mined from discovering one were considerable. With that in mind, Ardale took the job. If the glory of discovering a dungeon should go to anyone, it may as well be her. Ardale was familiar with the missing reclaimers she'd been sent to find. Mayhew and Amanda Barrow, a husband and wife team she'd come across on more than a few jobs. Not rank amateurs, but not exactly on her level either. Few were. But they were capable of doing somewhat respectable work. Honestly, though, they'd been the very definition of middling, working-class talent. How would a pair of pluggers like them discover the location of a dungeon? It boggled the mind. As Ardale came closer to the source of the scent, she heard laughter. It was harsh, guttural, bestial. Could the throats of men produce so repugnant a sound? How could laughter be so repulsive? Her flesh crawled just to hear it, as though the filthy noise was coating her skin in vile mucilage. Caution now to slow her approach, Ardale decided to observe from the cover of a large tree, where she wouldn't easily be seen. A terrible sight greeted her. There were monstrous-looking figures surrounding a poorly constructed cooking fire, ugly and misshapen grey shapes with slumped shoulders. She'd seen their like before, and an intense loathing for them quickly roiled up from deep within her. It was what some might call the arachnid effect. The encounter was something so fundamentally opposed to your idea of what should be, that you cannot help but wish it extinguished at once. Exterminated. Ardale hated these things. She knew them to be a wrongness in her world, something the creators had never intended. Filthy bastards, she thought to herself. Their barrows had been taken by the Skarn. With that recognition came a terrible thought. I hope they had time to kill themselves. It was unlikely. The Skarn were vicious creatures, feared for their sadistic urges. Torture and things worse than torture were what they inflicted upon those unfortunate enough to fall into their grasp. Although the temple taught its believers that none of the mortal races were completely evil, and all were deserving of salvation, the Skarn fought hard to dispel that optimistic notion. Everything they did was deviltry. They did not deserve to exist. The proof of it lay in what had been done to the barrows. From her hiding place, Ardale soon saw a pair of bodies beside the fire. From the size of the first one, she knew it had been Mayhew. He'd been a hard-working man in his middle years, used to a life of toil, but always quick to laugh. He'd been strong, too, a powerful figure who towered over smaller men. Confident and kind, there was little in the world he feared. Now he was nothing more than a mound of unknitted skin and muscle, Pieces of him had been torn away and were now being cooked by his slavering murderers. When death claimed him, his eyes had been wide open. His expression was terrible. But that was nothing compared to the attention the Scarn had paid his wife. The sight of Amanda Barrow's body broke something inside Ardell's mind. This was an unkind world, she knew. The weak were often preyed upon, and justice was often decided by who drew their sword faster or lied more convincingly. But even knowing that, Ardell rebelled against the horror set before her eyes. This was wrong. No, worse than wrong. This was offensive. No one deserved to die like this, not even rivals in business. Worst of all was the delight these smiling killers took in their deeds. They had ransacked the Barley's belongings and were now dancing happily before their campfire, as if they were rejoicing in the very act of erasing their victim's existence. Their joy was poisonous to her. Murderous anger flooded Ardell's heart, and although she ordinarily disdained such intense feelings, she was now lost in a blinding red rage. She was going to kill each one of those bastards. She only regretted she couldn't do it as slowly and painfully as they deserved. Oh, to hear that laughter change into screams. To put a hand beneath the breast of one and smile at his helplessness as she slowly crushed his heart. The dry rustling of leaves caught her ear and snapped her attention back from her fantasy. Ardell spun to her left and saw a Scarn standing 10 paces away, grinning at her. He crept up on her, or she'd been distracted by her thoughts. That was embarrassing. Ardell hated feeling embarrassed. The light of the campfire was reflected in the Scarn's yellowed eyes, and it coloured his irises red. His grey, lumpy skin looked like an outer layer of sediment, while his oversized limbs and scrawny torso gave him a stick-like appearance of frailty that belied the terrible strength she knew his kind possessed. His needle-sharp teeth completed the horrid image, as he happily rang his tongue against their tips, dripping blood over his back lips, uncaring in the least of the injury he caused himself. In his left hand he held a russet sword with a pitted blade. In his right hand he held himself, an erect stump of pustule-encrusted rot that slowly grew more erect the closer he stepped to the girl. Okay, you first, Ardell thought with a snarl. Before the monster could act on his obscene ardor, Ardell raised an open palm towards him and cast Wind Spear, which thrust a penetrating burst of condensed air straight into his eye. The Scarn squealed, first in surprise, then in pain. As it did, Ardell quickly closed the distance between them and ran one of her daggers across his throat. A vicious slash from right to left that swiftly transformed the monster's screams into bloody gurgling. Not satisfied, not nearly satisfied, Ardell drew her other blade and jammed it deeply into the Scarn's neck before giving it a vigorous twist. Then she pulled it out and brought both her weapons down repeatedly, relishing the thrill of dominating a lesser thing. This was good. This was right. This was fun. This was living. It had been a while since she last killed anyone. Not that she counted this appalling mockery of life as a person. Ardell much preferred completing her missions cleanly when she could. It always felt strange having to do otherwise. Strange, but not unpleasant. Some people needed to die, that was just a fact. Her satisfaction in her kill was interrupted by an alarmed shouting coming towards her. The Scarn's house had drawn the attention of his allies. That was good. She was warmed up now. The fools came rushing at her, roaring with hate and need. They saw an attractive woman standing in the dark over their mutilated brother and raced to her, heedless of her blades. They weren't particularly interested in avenging him, so much as hurting her. There was nothing the Scarn enjoyed as much as destroying that which was beautiful. The sight of her filled them with glee, until she began filling them with steel. They had the numbers and ferocity. Ardell had skill and magic. It was a one-sided slaughter. She danced gracefully between them. Her speed was now increased to superhuman levels by the spell, Grace of the Wind, which allowed her to easily evade their clumsy attempts to grab at her, while she also deflected the untrained strikes of their weapons. Her blades tore fiercely into their malformed bodies, opening their flesh, which provided them as much resistance to her as brittle fall leaves. When she was done, only one was left standing, staring at her in horrified bewilderment. His expression seemed to say, "This isn't how it was supposed to be." Ardell's withering smile seemed to say, "Oh, yes, it is." She raised her open palm towards him. He turned to run, but it was far too late. A high-pitched shriek of agony filled the night. Now feeling much better, Ardell continued with her mission. Ardell was making good progress. A life lived outdoors had given her a great stamina that was well above that of an ordinary person. This, combined with her natural gift for wind magic, gave her speed that couldn't easily be matched. On flat terrain, she covered great distances easily. Skarn in the darkened forest. Where had they come from? For those disgusting creatures to be this far north, it was simply unheard of. Someone had to have brought them here intentionally. It was unlikely that a single party of raiders could travel the great distance here from their homelands without being challenged. There was also likely more of them than that group she butchered. Skarn were cowards who preferred the safety of large numbers. The fact that they had appeared in the vicinity of a suspected dungeon led Ardell to one of two possible conclusions. Either the creatures were spawning from within the dungeon and were now moving into the outside world, which, while unpleasant to think of, was certainly a possibility, or more likely, considering how weak those monsters had been, a rival faction opposing the Arium Order was now laying claim to the dungeon and had summoned the Skarn to protect their interests. There was only one way to find out. By the gods, I'm definitely charging extra for this, she decided. There was a town within 15 kilometers of the Dusken Woods. What had his name been? Duskvale? Duskvin? No, it had been Duskville. That was the name. It was an unassuming place, nothing special, barely important enough to have cobbled roads. The sort of town Ardell would have never given a moment's thought to while flying over it in the sky carriage. They were going to have to be warned. When Skarn gathered in large numbers, they always began wandering. They'd eventually discover the town and raid it. The people living there may have been provincial nobodies, but that didn't mean they deserved to be turned into playthings for monsters. Find the dungeon, kill a few feral freaks, then go save the day. All in a day's work for a professional, Ardell thought smugly to herself. Which was the exact moment she fell face first into the stranger's chest. Time passed. Seconds, minutes, hours. It was hard for Ardell to tell. Did she have a concussion? She groaned and tried to stand up before stumbling back down as a sudden spell of dizziness stole her balance. Gingerly, she traced her hand across her forehead and winced at the light contact. When she inspected her fingertips, they were wet with blood. What the hell did I run into? She asked herself. There was nothing around. Nothing. A moment later, a shadow fell across her face, answering her question. The first thing Ardell noticed about the stranger was that he was almost naked. He was shirtless and barefoot, and wore a tattered pair of breeches that were barely hanging in there. The second thing Ardell noticed was that he was filthy. He was covered in dry blood and dirt, and he didn't smell very nice either. He was thin, bordering on malnourished, and stood at an average height, with overgrown brown hair that flapped wildly over his youthful face. He didn't look very old. In fact, by Ardell's estimate, he was barely out of boyhood, probably still in his late teens. He was pale too, as if his skin hadn't been kissed by the sun in months. His eyes were an unusual shade of hazel that shone above the bruised-looking bags beneath them. Those bags made him look like he slept poorly. If Ardell had to describe this boy, but was only permitted the use of one word, it would be merry, or perhaps gleeful. Despite his surroundings, he looked very happy, but it was the sort of happy you crossed the street to avoid, the sort of happy you fled on a dreary night. A dreary night like tonight, for example. The stranger turned his eyes to Ardell and smiled at her. Suddenly, she felt like a beetle that was a breath away from being skewered with a needle by a cruel child. The manic insanity of his smile bludgeoned her, made her feel weak and exposed. Ardell felt fear. Damn, she cursed inwardly. What was wrong with her? This was just some stupid boy. She wasn't afraid. Nothing made her feel afraid. Watch where you're going, she growled at the stranger, after climbing back to her feet. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. The harshness that outlined her voice suggested that one should always listen carefully when she spoke, no matter her volume. Gosh, I'm sorry, muttered the boy. She gave him another glare, mindful to keep a certain distance away from him. I really didn't see you there, sorry, he repeated. He shrugged his shoulders haplessly and gave her an embarrassed grin. It gets dark around here. So I see, Ardell said. And just what are you doing out here dead in the centre of the Dusken Woods? It's a dangerous place for a boy your age to go camping. A small frown creased the stranger's brow before he resumed his friendly expression. Well, gosh, miss. I was just walking my dogs was all. Must have lost track of the time. You just lost track of the time, Ardell said with suspicion. Goodness, why'd you say it like that? Because I think you're lying. From the sight of you, you've been out here for ages. Doing what, I wonder? Hey, I feel like we're getting off to a bad start. Would you like me to apologize again? Are you going to answer my question? Ardell asked mildly. I told you. I was walking my dogs. Then where are they? Funny you should ask. Multiple low-pitched growls came to Ardell's ears as she realized to her chagrin that she'd been surrounded. 6 large and dangerous-looking wolf-like monsters now stood around her, baring their teeth in warning. Ardell relaxed her hands and took a deep breath to still her pounding heart. Dogs, the idiot had said. These weren't dogs. They were a pack of direfangs. It made no sense. Direfangs were ferociously independent, and were far likelier to eat a man than obey him. Who was this boy? It was time to find out. One of the main secrets to Ardell's success as a reclaimer, besides her relentless physical and magical training, was her unique gift. She possessed the imbuement, discerning eye. It was an extremely rare, highly coveted B-ranked ability that granted her instant knowledge about anything or anyone she turned it towards. It had saved her many times over the years, by letting her know which battles to avoid and which battles she could win. It had also made her quite a bit of money by alerting her to when supposedly rare items of power were little more than manufactured fakes, or when supposed pieces of scrap were in reality incredibly valuable finds. With the eye, she had knowledge, and knowledge was always power. Name: Morrison Cobb. Race: human. Rank: free. Alignment: neutral good. Attack: 20. Mana: 0 out of 0. Skills: woodcutting. Threat assessment: minimal. Oh, for God's sake, Ardell thought uncharitably to herself. The direfangs themselves were only rank 5. Nothing here was a threat to her. She put her hands on her hips irritably and pointed a finger at the boy. Call them off, kid, or I'm collecting their pelts. Damn it, wasting my time with this crap, she muttered. Huh? The boy asked, confused. I said call them off. Look, I'm on a job here, and I've got no time to play with a local weirdo. How does some wood-cutting yokel like you get this far into the woods anyway without getting eaten by something? You're a lot luckier than you look, Morrison. Who? He asked, with what seemed like sincere confusion. Ardell wasn't buying it. Drop the act already. How'd you tame these direfangs anyway? I know you don't have a beast taming skill. Let me guess, you stole them from their mother when they were still pups. Only scrubs resort to kidnapping babies. Hey, I only did that once and gave her back when they paid the ransom. What now? Whatever, I don't care. Take my warning though, boy. There are Skarn running wild in this forest, and if they find you, they're going to make you their bride. Take your little pack and get lost. Don't bother thanking me. Just leave while you still can. Ardell stepped closer to Morrison and gave him a final discerning look before saying, By the way, what kind of a woodcutter travels this far into a forest and forgets his axe? Maybe you should seek a different profession. Just a thought. With that said, Ardell pushed past Morrison and continued on her way. Long after she left, Morrison could only scratch his head in bewilderment and say, Huh.